I'm Amy and I'm codependent. And I just celebrated last week 2 years with CoDA. And it's been an amazing 2 years. I often joke in my group that when I'm sharing, I kind of black out. And honestly, that can describe like my entire first year in CoDA. I feel like it was a blackout experience. Like there were moments when I was present and growing. And then there were moments where I'm like, where did the last 3 months go and who am I? And so it's in my nature to research, to categorize, to organize. And I'm now realizing it's a little bit part of my codependency, but it also gives me comfort. And so when I've been thinking about how I wanted to share my experience, strength, and hope with all of you, I realized that it kind of falls under the umbrella of the stages of grief, what I went through. And it's because I was grieving the loss of my old self. I'll often refer to myself as old Amy and new Amy. And old Amy went through a lot. And I also am grieving the loss of friends and relationships that I had. I grieve the loss of comfortable behaviors that feel really, really good in the moment and then feel really like coda crazy afterwards. I miss being able to not have to always think before I do or say things because giving advice was so easy, right? Just I could roll through it and not even think twice and have a whole conversation. Now I realize that a lot of that was my codependency speaking. And the first stage is denial. And I was in denial a long time before I ever walked through the doors to my first CODA meeting. And I actually had a high school friend that I reconnected with on Facebook that recommended years ago that I go to Codependence Anonymous. And I was like, Codependence Anonymous, what's that? And I looked it up a little bit and I was like, yeah, sounds good. Not me. Nope, I'm good. Right. So I didn't go for years. Then I remember sitting at home and my parents were visiting, and they both are in Al Anon family groups and have been in recovery for over 30 years. And they said that they were shocked that between their two families, because we're a blended family, that none of the six of us have attended any 12 step groups at all. And I was thinking about that and I was like, well, neither of you are alcoholics. Like, we don't have the same problems that you have. And my stepdad was like, it doesn't matter. It still passes on to you. And I'm like, yeah, it passes on in the form of codependency, is now what I realize. So I may have been fortunate enough that neither of my parents turned towards addictions to deal with their childhoods, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily poured in the healthiest behaviors and the best parenting strategies into me. And so I was created early, early, early on as a codependent person. And I didn't really acknowledge this and the spiral until 2 years ago when one of my really, really close friends passed away. And we weren't very close at the end. And I remember I was devastated, like abnormally emotional about the death. And then I threw that emotion into a work problem that wasn't mine to solve and took that on. And things just spiraled until I was just this ball of emotions that was so unmanageable and so out of control that I finally admitted that something had to happen, something had to break. And I remember that happening when I said, like, oh, if I showed up for my friend, if I went to her house, I could have saved her. And I was like, who are you? Like, no, you couldn't have saved her. She's an adult. That's her life, her health. And that's not for you to take on or control. So I go to my first CODA meeting. And now that I've been in for 2 years, I definitely see pretty much the same trend of a newcomer. We're all just kind of sitting there like, what did I get myself into? And I remember crying in my share because, again, I was an emotional wreck. and denying it at that meeting. I might be codependent, I'm not sure. And I should have inserted like an LOL there, like, okay, right. Like you were for sure codependent. But I was in strongly in denial. And it took me a couple more meetings. And then I'm like, all right, I think this is me. So I jumped into a step study pretty quickly. I started CODA at the very end of April and I did a summer step study right thereafter. And the minute the step study started, boy, did I transition into anger. Anger, anger, anger. I call it my angry phase, like months of anger. And I am not an angry person. I don't lose my temper easy. I'm not walking around with a chip over my shoulder. And it bled into everything. My children noticed. And I mean, I was so isolated, I had no friends to notice. So I guess that was a saving grace. But I took it out on everybody, and I was angry at myself, my parents, my ex-husband. Like, who was I not angry with at this point? And so it took a lot of digging. And when I was doing my step study, I realized that I could only dig so deep because when I started going through the layers, I wasn't ready. Like I couldn't handle it. I was dealing with so much that I needed to process some of the anger, let some of it settle. And so I really truly understood the purpose of a step study being meant to be done like multiple times. Work the steps a different time for a different reason. And this time I was just kind of scratching the surface when I did the steps. And so that helped though to kind of dissipate some of my anger and help me to like move on. And in the stages of grief, there's the bargaining. I didn't really have much of it except in the form of, well, maybe I didn't have to let this friendship go. Maybe I don't have to lose that part of old me. And I realized a lot of that was just me trying to hold on to old parts of me because of the comfort and that I didn't really need it. But the bargaining, it wasn't a lot. And that's the beautiful thing about the stages of grief. Not everybody goes through them the same. They're not linear stages meant to be like 1, 2, 3, 1 month, 1 month, 1 month. It's ebbs and flows and it's pieces. And so the good news is about like being able to acknowledge that I was grieving. It means that like I think in that acknowledgement, I was also reclaiming some worth. Like I was worth grieving. I was worth being upset for. And even though I was mad to be codependent and that I would never be magically healed, it was okay. But sadly, that transitioned into depression. Like, how am I supposed to trust myself to make good decisions for future relationships? Who the heck am I? Like, my entire existence felt like it was centered around being codependent. I'm a parent with codependent tendencies. I'm an educator, which tends to lean towards codependent tendencies too. And which part of being an educator is me, and which part of it is codependency? And I just found myself for months pausing and questioning that over and over. And that just led to a bit more of a spiral into the depression because I just wanted to be me. And I didn't know how to be me without the codependency. And it was really hard. And someone had mentioned at some point in time that what codependents have is a process addiction. So other addictions have chemicals, people, items, but what I was addicted to was a way of living, a way of communicating with others, being in relationships, and communicating with others is not going away. It's not something that I can put in a cabinet and lock up. And like, that was hard. Like, how am I supposed to go about my life and not be codependent? So it's, and then I was worried I was messing up my children. I'm passing this on to them. I'm doing too much for them. I didn't know how to be a different type of mother because I thought me doing everything for everyone was being an amazing mother. And when I really took a moment to pause, I realized that I was denying them the opportunity to do for themselves. I was denying them the opportunity to develop their own trust and worth without me having to feed into that. And so, as part of my CODA journey, I backed off in a lot of things. And my children are older, but not like, they're adults. Two of them are now. Only one of them was when I started CODA. And they didn't like the coda very much. And they vocalized it because they could. And one of them, even at one point in time, was like, "This coda thing you're doing, I feel like it's hurting us as a family." Well, it's because I was trusting them to take care of themselves, trusting them to be able to handle themselves. And I hadn't been up to that point, or not to the extent I should have. And so there was a little bit of growing pains as a family, but to see the growth in me 2 years later and to see the growth in my family and my children made it worth it. Like, it's so amazing. And that would transition us to like the acceptance part, right? Of the stages of grief. So I actually really started accepting my codependency about 6 months in. Like, I went to through my step study, I went to my first retreat. I was starting to do service work, and I realized that it was just part of who I was, part of my story being codependent, and there was nothing to be ashamed of. It was okay to feel. So, okay, be angry, right? Okay, be upset or depressed for part of this, but also know that I can move past that when I'm ready. And I didn't feel the need to be forced to be like quick with it. I just let myself sit in it. I was stewing a little bit in some of those feelings. And in that stewing came growth. And it didn't always feel good. But I think that's kind of the point. When I remember back to when my kids were like young and growing and they would complain about pains, they were literally having growing pains. So if I transfer that same logic to myself, my growth probably will not be pain free, especially when some of the things I've been doing for a lifetime. And so part of my acceptance was openly sharing with others. I started talking about it at work. Like, I was like, "Hey, I go to a 12-step group for codependence. And so I'm not going to be able to do what I did for you previously." And they didn't like that. And it was hard for me to hold my ground in that because I am really, really good at people pleasing, at overachieving, and I needed to stand my ground that I can do a good job without overdoing it. And so there was some discomfort in that. And then came my infamous boundaries. Many of the people in my home group will laugh about the fact that boundaries is my thing. It's funny to say boundaries are my thing because let me tell you, old Amy didn't even know what that was. Boundaries were not a thing. I would let people walk all over me. I would think that their words were the truth when maybe it was just abuse. Not maybe, it was abuse. And it took a long time for me to be comfortable having boundaries and to feel that I was worth having boundaries. And now I know I am, and that it is okay to say no. It is okay to maybe say yes, but with I can only do so much. And I don't need to keep trying to do more just to prove that I'm loved, prove that I'm worth the job. And that feels really great to say that. And as an educator and a parent, I've noticed my own dialogue has changed. And I will say things like, you're worth taking the time to think about this. You're worth being proud of yourself. And it just feels like a glow inside of myself when I say those things because I realize that I'm reflecting what I feel myself. And I did not feel this way 2 years ago. And CoDA has brought that type of joy to me. And in the 90s, there's the concept that a sixth stage of grief has come about, and it's like hope, finding purpose. And I feel like that's part of why I'm here today. Service work has given me a purpose, but also allowed me to practice healthy behaviors. Because when I first started doing service work, I wanted to do the same thing I've always done: be perfect, people please, overwork. I tried to mold myself into what other people were doing. And thankfully, I caught it fairly quickly because I'm more aware now. And so every time I feel myself doing that, I pull back. I've had uncomfortable uncomfortable conversations with people that I would have been too scared to have before. In my service work, it's allowed me to the opportunity to practice my healthy and loving relationships that we're all striving for in Codependence Anonymous. And I actively work on my 12th step, sharing about it. And I just recently started sponsoring, and that has been another addition that I'm enjoying and I was really scared of, which seems crazy. I am literally an educator by trade. And you would think sponsoring would be something I would jump into head first, but I was scared because I didn't want to lose myself in it. I didn't want to have no boundaries again. And so I just really appreciate the opportunity that it's given me to vocalize and practice that. And every single day, I'm thankful for CODA and for just all that it's given me to my life. Thank you all for listening. I'm Amy and I'm codependent.